What if I told you that the Peaky Blinders series was inspired by a true story? Yeah, the Peaky Blinders have existed, but not the way you think. Brace yourself, because there was no real Thomas Shelby, no Arthur Shelby, no Shelby family, and certainly no Shelby company. The actual Peaky Blinders, however, held sway over Birmingham long before the 1920s. Unlike their fictional counterparts, their gang was loosely organized, yet far more violent and vicious. Yet, after World War I, a truly active gang did emerge in Birmingham. This crew was known as the Birmingham Boys, and a man named Billy Kimber was at its helm. That name probably rings a bell, doesn't it? Remember the gangster who pops up in Season 1, Episode 2 of the series? The one who barges into the Shelby's bar to have a word with Tommy? Well, if you had to pick a real-life inspiration for Tommy, Billy Kimber would be the guy. Of course, that's with a few major caveats, and that's putting it mildly. But he wasn't the only character from the show who actually existed. Darby Sabini and Alfie Solomons were also real figures in the 1920s. We'll get to them in a bit. First, let's dig into who the true Peaky Blinders really were. To truly grasp the roots of the real Peaky Blinders, we first need to discuss the sloggers. This term literally meant people who deliver violent blows. Initially, it was a boxing term from the 1820s. But its usage rapidly spilled out of the ring. Why bring up the sloggers, sometimes called slogging gangs? Because that's precisely where it all began. For that, we have to travel back to the late 1850s in England. At that time, the country was grappling with mounting economic hardship. These difficulties, in turn, fueled an even more serious problem later on: the rise of violence in impoverished neighborhoods. Birmingham would suffer immensely from this violence throughout the latter half of the 19th century, especially with the emergence of young thug gangs, who would later be dubbed the sloggers. The sloggers were lowlifes constantly loitering in Birmingham's grimy, impoverished streets. They would rob passers-by, assault them, brutally fight among themselves, or set up illegal bets. They seemed to have nothing better to do than engage in unscrupulous activities and disturb the peace. Legend has it these gangs of young bullies formed in Birmingham in the late 1850s, right after the police, pressured by the upper class, decided to crack down on their crimes. Some of the city's youth, however, didn't take kindly to that. They banded together to form crews that would actively resist law enforcement. That's how the slogging gangs were born, marking the true genesis of the Peaky Blinders. Following these police interventions, the sloggers, or members of the slogging gangs, got better organized and formed crews specifically to fight the police, so they could continue their criminal activities with impunity. This lawlessness was, to say the least, unsustainable, because they weren't just content with assaulting the police, but also anyone they encountered, men, women, young, or old. Similar street gangs popped up in other major cities too, like Manchester, Salford, Liverpool, and London. But Birmingham became the epicenter of the most virulent criminal activity. It's no wonder the city was recognized by the late 19th century as one of Great Britain's most violent.
In Birmingham's dark and grimy backstreets, slogging gangs reignet supreme.
Each gang typically numbered around 100 young people. Most came armed with knives, razor blades, or hammers. Used to robberies, riots, and even murders, they cast a truly terrifying shadow over the city. Police struggled to get a handle on the chaotic situation, but unfortunately, due to severe understaffing, they were largely helpless. This surge in gang violence truly took off in the 1870s. Back then, it wasn't uncommon to witness groups of hundreds of young people brawling for hours on end. Sometimes, these fights escalated to a deadly conclusion. The sloggers were capable of anything, and a police report from Sunday, April 7, 1872, perfectly illustrates this. On that particular day, a mob of roughly 400 young individuals converged on the Cheapside district to unleash pure chaos. They smashed windows and caused widespread havoc, much to the consternation of the residents. Afterward, they moved on to the Hill Street area, continuing their rampage by pelting shopkeepers' windows with bricks and stones. One shopkeeper was actually struck and later transported to the hospital. But these young thugs didn't stop there. Some even went as far as stopping passers-by simply to terrorize and insult them. It was only when a small group of police officers approached to disperse them that these unruly youths finally decided to flee back to Cheapside, their home district. So, that gives you a sense of what they were capable of. And that's just one example of many. Just 3 days after that incident, these young thugs were at it again. A group of 70 to 80 of them, armed with sticks and large stones. The group gathered near downtown Birmingham, and what did they do there? They actually stoned a police officer. 2 were arrested, and guess what? The first, a boy named John Gibbon, was only 13 years old, while the second, Michael Lowry, was just a year older. Indeed, most sloggers were young teenagers, but you'd be wise not to judge them by their age. If you ever had the misfortune to cross them, the consequences could be absolutely dire. The testimony of Magistrate Alderman Melson, one of the victims of the April 7, 1872 riots, painfully confirms this. On the day the sloggers had wreaked havoc, they passed by his home. Unwilling to let them get away with it, Mr.
Melson
stepped out with a stick, intending to strike them and make them scatter. But then his son intervened, and everything spiraled into a nightmare. His son followed the gang and grabbed their leader. Alone against the mob, he was violently attacked. The consequences were horrific, Mr.
Melsons son came home covered in blood.
With a cut lip and ears. As you've probably gathered, the sloggers were not to be trifled with. But how do we explain this explosion of violence in Birmingham during the late 19th century? For starters, one explanation lies in the severe lack of recreational outlets for the youth in impoverished districts. Under the laws of the era, young boys, most of whom worked in factories, weren't permitted to work past 6 p.m. Consequently, after their shifts, they'd simply hang around in the streets and find ways to entertain themselves. Sadly, their free time often veered into delinquency, which then fueled the surge in violence. Another reason can be traced back to the 1840s. A period that saw the working class of Birmingham develop a deep-seated antagonism toward the police. Law enforcement officers were widely seen as enemies by the residents of these poor neighborhoods. This hostility escalated as the police force became increasingly present in impoverished areas. Their policing style had shifted from simple patrols to a far more coercive and punitive approach. That's when the sloggers emerged, these gangs of young, disruptive troublemakers. The street was the sloggers' domain, their sole playground, and there was no way they were going to let the police interfere with that. In a country where so much was denied to them, this was virtually all they had left.
Just the street.
From 1867 to 1880, criminal activity was at its peak. During this time, police faced systematic violence whenever they attempted to curb the sloggers' neighborhood disturbances. The sloggers, with their favorite betting game, pitch and toss, which involved throwing a coin as close as possible to a marked spot, had a knack for generating loud noise, considerably disturbing the peace of Birmingham's honest citizens. On multiple occasions, police officers tried to intervene, but the young thugs consistently drove them off with stones. During these counterattacks, some officers suffered serious injuries, forcing them to back down from confronting the sloggers. Police inaction in the face of this widespread problem was long criticized by newspapers and the public in Birmingham, who were utterly exasperated by the situation. But the root issue always came back to the same thing. Law enforcement agencies were drastically understaffed compared to the sheer number of troublemakers. Consider 1867, for instance. The Birmingham Police Department had only 400 officers. That's one officer for every 813 residents. How could they possibly tackle the problem effectively with those numbers? It's hardly surprising, then, that gang-related issues only intensified afterward. Indeed, the criminal element of Birmingham continued to prey on police officers whenever they tried to shut down their illegal gambling operations. Assaults on pedestrians remained rampant, and turf wars between rival gangs multiplied rapidly. In short, night after night, Birmingham streets turned into a stage for almost uncontrollable violence. The sheer brutality rampant in the city's working-class areas eventually garnered national attention. Birmingham became a city scorned throughout England. By the late 1880s, the sloggers continued to wreak havoc across Birmingham. Back then, there was certainly no shortage of thug gangs. They seemed to pop up everywhere, and that's precisely how the Peaky Blinders came into being. It wasn't until 1890, in fact, that the term Peaky Blinders first surfaced. So, who exactly were they? Contemporary accounts describe them as one of Birmingham's most feared street gangs. Don't imagine, however, that they were well-dressed, charismatic figures revered by Birmingham's working class, as depicted in the series. Quite the opposite, in fact. Hailing from impoverished neighborhoods, they certainly couldn't afford the sharp suits seen on Thomas Shelby or other characters in the show. Tracing their roots back to the sloggers, they were largely uneducated and commanded little respect. They inflicted real harm upon the people of Birmingham. They were mostly small-time thugs, thieves, and even assaulters of women, whose crimes were limited to a local scale. In short, there was nothing remarkable or glamorous about them at all. One burning question remains, though: where did the name Peaky Blinders actually come from? Are there any details that can shed more light on this notorious gang? In a literal sense, Peaky Blinders translates to blinding caps.
VHY blinding caps?
Because a popular rumor at the time suggested that the Peaky Blinders sewed razor blades into the brims of their caps. This would have been handy during fights, allowing them to use the cap as a weapon. The blade would slice their enemies' foreheads, causing blood to stream into their eyes, temporarily blinding them. But was this legend true? Did the Peaky Blinders actually conceal razor blades in the visors of their caps? Well, prepare to be disappointed, because the answer leans heavily towards no. For starters, there's currently no historical evidence to support the claim. Beyond that, it would have been virtually impossible for the Peaky Blinders to acquire razor blades with such frequency. At the close of the 19th century, disposable razor blades weren't widely available and were quite expensive. Generally, young men back then used straight razors for shaving or went directly to a barber. So, if this anecdote is indeed a myth, what's the true story behind the name? In reality, the name likely originated from the Peaky Blinders' distinctive habit of wearing their caps tilted to the side. They'd fold the cap down so much that it would practically obscure one of their eyes.
Hence, blinding caps.
Ultimately, it was simply a distinct clothing style, one that actually evolved through two different phases. The initial style featured loose-fitting trousers that flared at the bottom, a belt with a large buckle, sturdy boots, a specific type of jacket, and a bright scarf. Completing the look was a melon hat with an elongated brim, paired with a haircut that was very short, and styled with a long, angled tuft of hair on the forehead. Later, another style emerged, introducing two key changes. The Peaky Blinders swapped their bowler hats for flat caps, and their slicked-back tuft evolved into something resembling a donkey's fringe. A fringe that, according to contemporary accounts, gave the wearer a positively devilish appearance. As for their weaponry, the Peaky Blinders typically employed belts, sticks, bricks, brass knuckles, pocket knives, and sometimes even lengths of catgut with stones tied to the end. While the Peaky Blinders were recognized as a specific gang in the 1890s. It's important to understand that the term later became, from the early 20th century onward, a generic moniker for any kind of street tough in Birmingham, whether they were part of a formal gang or not. Born to neglectful parents and from disadvantaged backgrounds, the street, just like for the sloggers before them, became their preferred playground. From an early age, they'd hit the streets with other boys their age to commit all sorts of crimes. Peaky Blinders members ranged in age from 12 to 30. Noteworthy examples include Charles Lambourne, who was 12, and David Taylor, who was 13. Along with Henry Fowler, another young Peaky Blinder close in age. Despite the chasm separating them from respectable society, the Peaky Blinders didn't live entirely on the fringes. In fact, most lived in the poorer working-class sections of Birmingham. They were integrated into their communities and held regular jobs, just like everyone else. Their occupations were quite varied back then. Some were factory workers, others toiled in the copper trade, or earned their living as gold beaters. At the end of the day, these were working-class guys, but their idea of unwinding after a long shift was nothing short of brutal. In reality, the Peaky Blinders were seen as utter cowards. They only found the courage to take on the police or commit their crimes when they had the safety of a group. They typically followed the direction of a leader, but their gangs were loosely organized at best. Getting rich, however, was never really their primary motivation. While some did run protection rackets, most Peaky Blinders truly only cared about one thing: the fight. When a Peaky Blinder did get arrested, they tended to get off pretty lightly. Sentences were often just a few days, a few weeks, or maybe a few months, but strangely never amounted to years. Ultimately, this leniency from the justice system just emboldened them to continue their ways. The residents of Birmingham were getting fed up, and their complaints grew louder and more frequent. You can hardly blame them. It became impossible to walk around at night without running into gangs of young thugs looking to beat and assault people. The city even earned the nickname Peaky Blinders City as its violence continued to spiral. The streets were infested with this element, whose only purpose seemed to be terrorizing honest, hard-working people again and again. Fortunately, the reign of the Peaky Blinders was about to come to an end. The TV show introduces a determined character, Detective Campbell, hell-bent on cleaning up the crime and corruption in Birmingham. He's physically imposing and full of cunning, making the fight against the criminal underworld his personal crusade, with a special focus on the Shelbys. Of course, after a few episodes, the fictional Campbell fails in his mission and is unable to stop the Peaky Blinders. One might assume this reflects what happened in real life, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The real Peaky Blinders, however, faced their own version of Detective Campbell. His name was Charles Houghton Rafter, a police officer originally from Belfast. Unlike his fictional counterpart, Rafter actually succeeded in dismantling the city's criminal element. It was the epidemic of brutality plaguing Birmingham in the late 19th century, along with the murders of police officers by the Peaky Blinders, that led to his appointment as the city's chief of police. For the locals, the Peaky Blinders had held power for far too long. The constant attacks on citizens and police, combined with the justice system's infuriating indulgence, made intervention an urgent necessity. The situation was indeed urgent, as one particular anecdote chillingly illustrates. At the height of the Peaky Blinders' power, a gang armed with belt buckles and knives allegedly set upon a poor man, stabbing him nearly to death and beating him mercilessly. A witness to the assault later testified in court. As he was leaving the courthouse, members of the same gang stabbed him in retaliation. The gang's leader, a known Peaky Blinder, was eventually arrested. He was sentenced to a mere 2 months in prison. Growing public pressure, therefore, unsurprisingly forced the government to act. Soon after, the authorities took charge of the situation and appointed Rafter to lead law enforcement in Birmingham. Charles Rafter was a police chief with formidable leadership skills. He was known for his effective policing methods, his steadfast attitude, and his clear-headedness. He was a man who understood organization and knew how to maintain his composure, even when a situation became critical. These qualities enabled him to make the streets of Birmingham safer and to finally rid the city of the Peaky Blinders for good. Rafter began his work in 1899. Before diving in, he meticulously studied the city of Birmingham and its unique characteristics. Then, to ensure his mission's success, he made certain his officers were as competent as possible. To join his force, recruits had to be intelligent, determined, brave, physically strong, capable fighters, and knowledgeable of all laws governing arrests. Rafter set to his task, but his first few years of service in Birmingham didn't yield the expected results. There was a severe shortage of manpower, and attacks against the police remained dangerously frequent. In the year 1899 alone, 9 policemen were permanently disabled following assaults by the Peaky Blinders. By 1901, Birmingham recorded over 500 assaults on police officers. Anarchy continued to grip the city, and Rafter's appointment as police chief hadn't yet turned the tide. The Peaky Blinders were still causing just as much trouble as ever. It wasn't until the early 1910s that the Peaky Blinders were finally eliminated. Several factors contributed to their downfall. First, there was Rafter and his men, who played a crucial role in eradicating the gangs. Thanks to their courage and a much-needed increase in their numbers, juvenile delinquency began to gradually fade away, leading to the Peaky Blinders' complete extinction. Another decisive factor was the valiant support Charles Rafter received from law-abiding citizens. Tired and infuriated by the Peaky Blinders' reign of terror, they decided against all odds to testify despite the intimidation they faced. Then came the end of judicial leniency toward the young thugs. Some Peaky Blinders were handed down heavy, exemplary sentences, including life imprisonment, which was a first for the time. The development of youth clubs also played a part in decreasing delinquency. Arnold Pinchard, a Birmingham clergyman, was one of the pioneers of this movement. Towards the end of the 19th century, Pinchard opened a club for young men, giving the new generation a place to unwind after work. Some of the Peaky Blinders could be found there playing cards, checkers, or dominoes. But what truly captured the young men's interest was boxing. Many of them were already accustomed to street fighting, and thanks to Pinchard, who began organizing competitions just 2 months after the club's founding, they could finally practice in a structured environment. Through boxing, these young men learned discipline, respect, and how to channel their energy into a more honorable activity. Alongside boxing, soccer was also becoming increasingly popular among the youth. Leagues like the Small Heath and District League were established, offering young people a more constructive way to occupy their time. We could also mention the rise of movie theaters, another form of entertainment that helped draw young people away from the streets. The school system also improved, thanks to government reforms in 1906, which provided better education for children, supported by medical treatments, and access to food and housing. In summary, the combination of a determined fight against delinquency and increased social support for the youth allowed the city to finally reclaim some of its former glory. By 1914, the Peaky Blinders were, for all intents and purposes, ancient history. Most of the former members ended up joining the army and serving in World War I. Few of them returned, and the lucky ones who survived were now older and more disciplined. Some started families and simply aged out of their old lives. However, even after World War I, the police were still battling street gangs. A number of the old Peaky Blinders had apparently survived the interwar period and continued to lead a life of crime. Many of them fell in with a man named Billy Kimber, the leader of the notorious Birmingham gang, which terrorized England's racetracks during the 1920s. While the show suggests there was no real Shelby family, that isn't entirely accurate. There was indeed a family in 1920s Birmingham with striking similarities, a family called the Sheldons. The two names sound remarkably alike, and there's a simple reason for that. The series creator, Stephen Knight, had a father whose uncles belonged to this very Sheldon family, a clan said to have ruled through fear in 1920s Birmingham. Some of its members were known as notorious criminals heavily involved in illegal gambling. For the series, Knight chose a name very close to the Sheldons, and thus the Shelbys were born. But what more do we know about the real Sheldons? Actually, not a great deal. However, there is some information that sheds light on this family so strangely connected to the fictional Shelbys. The Sheldons were a large family residing in Birmingham during the 1920s. They lived in a house on Witten Street, at the end of which stood the actual Garrison pub. Unlike their other siblings, 3 of the Sheldon brothers, John, Samuel, and Joseph, chose a life of crime. At the time, they were known as violent criminals involved in riots, shootings, and even one of the worst gang wars in Birmingham's history. Much like the Shelbys, they had business interests at the Birmingham racetracks. Their territory, however, was confined to that city. They never expanded their operations to the rest of England. To find a bigger fish in that pond, you have to turn to another gangster, William Billy Kimber, the leader of the Birmingham gang. Unlike the Sheldons, Kimber conducted criminal operations on a national scale. And contrary to his portrayal in the series, he was not a small man, nor did he come from London. Kimber was actually from the Summer Lane neighborhood of Birmingham and was a well-built, strong and charismatic man. There, he became the leader of a fearsome gang of thugs known as the Birmingham Gang, also called the Birmingham Boys. This wasn't a highly organized criminal group like the Mafia, but rather a loose collection of rowdy punks who, when assembled, were a formidable force. His gang was active from the 1910s to the 1930s, with a reach extending from London to the north of England. During those years, Kimber was considered the biggest crime boss in the United Kingdom. He was a gangster who feared no one but was feared by many. He got his start at the racetracks, running protection rackets and orchestrating pickpocketing rings. Over time, he transitioned into a legitimate, if ruthless, businessman. He built his empire on a foundation of fear and intimidation. This was precisely how he intended to conquer the south of England when he decided to expand his racetrack rackets. But as he moved south, particularly toward the capital, he ran into some serious trouble. To take over the rackets at the London racecourses, Kimber sent his men to handle the job. There, his henchmen targeted Jewish bookmakers located in the East End. The racketeers blackmailed them, attempting to squeeze even more money out of what their victims were already forced to pay. Typically, when victims of these rackets didn't pay up, they were brutally lynched. This was the fate that befell Alfie Solomons, a Jewish bookmaker from London who was not about to back down. The real Alfie Solomon was a secular Jew whose family had lived in England for decades. Unlike his TV counterpart, he was not a recent immigrant who had fled anti-Semitic pogroms in the Russian Empire. He became a bookmaker at the racetracks after the armistice of 1918. His business operated smoothly in London until Kimber and his crew came south to expand their operations. Things took a violent turn when Solomon refused to submit to the Birmingham gang's extortion. For his resistance, Solomon was savagely beaten and then kicked while he was down. When he was finally picked up, his face was a bloody mess, and he was missing several teeth. It may have seemed like just another brutal assault, but this attack would ignite a gang war between the North and the South. After being viciously attacked by Kimber's gang, Solomon sought help from a powerful gang operating in southern England, the Sabini gang, led by Darby Sabini, another character featured in the series. Sabini was the godfather of the Sicilian mafia in London at the time. His family, the Sabinis, dominated the underworld and the racetracks of southern England for much of the early 20th century. To build his criminal enterprise, it is said that Darby Sabini brought over more than 300 henchmen from Sicily to the British capital. He became a godfather figure in his neighborhood, reportedly dispensing justice, settling internal disputes, and protecting the honor of young women. Like Kimber, Sabini was an imposing figure who was afraid of no one. It was after the assault on Solomon that Sabini decided to go to war against Kimber and his gang. This North versus South rivalry would become known as the Racecourse War of 1921. However, this bloody dispute over control of England's racetrack protection rackets produced no clear winner, although the Sabini gang arguably had the upper hand. Kimber and Sabini eventually agreed to a truce, and the two continued their protection rackets within their respective territories. This arrangement didn't last long, as the police decided to get involved towards the end of the 1920s. They made a concerted effort to eradicate the bookmakers from the country's racetracks. Sabini was forced to pivot his activities to other ventures. As for Kimber, he spent some time in America before returning to England to continue his rackets on a smaller scale. Ultimately, the racketeers of 1920s England, much like the Peaky Blinders of the 1890s and 1910s, were anything but glamorous. Kimber was an extortionist who rose to power through violence and fear. He was also unfaithful to his first wife, abandoning his children to a life of poverty. Sabini, like Kimber, acquired his wealth through force and was, throughout his reign, a man of little respect. Alfie Solomon, though less influential than Kimber and Sabini, was just as cruel, once killing a man after a simple argument. The Sheldon brothers were known as scoundrels who consistently shied away from a fair fight. In short, all the gangsters mentioned shared the same core characteristics as the original Peaky Blinders. They were violent, vicious, sadistic, immoral, cowardly in a real battle, and utterly unworthy of respect. In the end, they are not the ones to be admired, as the television series might lead us to believe. The real admiration belongs to those who had the merit to stand up to them. I'm talking about the ordinary people of Birmingham who tried to remain honest and resist turning to violence when the Peaky Blinders reigned supreme. I'm talking about all those police officers who had the courage to confront these hordes of thugs, risking their own lives to do so. They are the real heroes of this story.